This video is entitled, Is Your Love for the Liturgy a Window to God or a Mirror of the Self? The Noble Search for the Sacred. We live in an age of the beige. Our modern architecture is clinical. Our music is disposable. Often church worship seems ugly, seems worldly, mundano, with guitars and loud, jarring music. For a generation starving for depth, the discovery of ancient paths, whether in Eastern Orthodoxy or the rad trads of one form or another, whether it's rad trad smells and bells or rad trad asceticism and radicality. I was more of that ilk when I was a youngster. But I did come in contact and we did have elements of that rad trad smells and bells as well. We just did the ascetical stuff as well and kind of specialized in that. It feels like finding a rainforest after a lifetime in the desert, doesn't it? Seeking the sacred is an act of spiritual bravery. It has to be said. The beauty of these traditions is not the problem. It is a profound technology of the soul that's being offered one. And I had profound encounters, especially through Eastern Orthodoxy. The liturgy led me to tears so many times. But I no longer think tears are the be all and end all or the criteria. The last time I was at an Eastern Orthodox monastery, in fact, I met a young lad who'd kind of been hoodwinked by a very radical order of Eastern Orthodox, kind of a cult, and had gotten very involved in this. And his criteria was, well, I melted in tears, and therefore it must be real. It's from God. Pure sentimentality, pure emotion. One cannot use this as our criteria. One must use the criteria of the Word as well as our conscience. Let's carry on. Because these traditions are so powerful, they carry a specific psychological risk. In Buddhism, this is called upadana, clinging. Now, I'm using Buddhism here, not because of the religion, but because it has such powerful psychological insights, ones that parallel with hesychasm and the interior way of Eastern Orthodoxy especially, but also of traditional Roman Catholicism, as we'll see in a bit. And that's why I invoke Buddhism, so don't switch off at this point. In Buddhism, this is called upadana, clinging. We tend to turn a tool for liberation into a prop for the ego. The upper room versus the basilica. The historical reality. To understand why we cling to fancy liturgies, we have to look at what they replaced. It is beyond doubt that for the first 300 years of the church, that there was no sacred St. John Chrysostom Mass. Of course, there wasn't St. John Chrysostom liturgy or traditional Gregorian liturgies. There was, in fact, a meal, the Agape feast, the Eucharist. It held in private homes. Slaves sat with masters, women with men. There were no altars, no pews, and no sacred distance. There was free access to the throne of grace. There was a table fellowship. There was a meal. They called it the Agapes. Love, selfless love. The simplicity of it all. Jesus used common bread and a shared cup. He was a Galilean disruptor of religious elitism, if ever there was one, not an imperial official. In the early church, there were no functions, elders. There were no castes. These were roles that were played within the household communities. The elder brothers, not people who had a cushy number living on the fat of the land while others went out and worked. There's an evolution from the house church where everyone's equal and there are those in roles. So if I come with a word to the table in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, it describes all of this. Some comes with a word, someone comes with a prophecy, test the prophecies. Somebody comes with a teaching, he's a teacher. Somebody comes with a prophecy, he's a prophet. But that doesn't mean to say I've always got the habit of a prophet on. I'm now a prophet for the rest of my days, even if I'm a total muppet. No, not at all. In the context of brothers, where slaves are sitting with free men, where men and women are together and there's a oneness there. Where have we gone? Well, we've gone to the Byzantine Empire. We've gone to Imperial Christianity, which was not on the mind of Jesus Christ or Paul or the earliest Christians. Let us continue. The imperial shift. Everything changed with Constantine. People don't like to hear that and guffaw about it. But at the end of the day, this is what the scholarship, this is what historical theology tells us. Christianity moved into Roman basilicas. And the church councils too, go and research them. Use AI for one thing. You don't have to go to libraries anymore. Research how and where did the liturgies develop? The early church, what did it look like? And what were the councils that moved the early church to start looking like the Orthodox Church or the traditional Roman Catholic Church? What were these councils and when did they come about? For example, the Roman uniform. Bishops were granted the rank of judges, the fancy gowns, the stoles, the frocks, the brocade, where the standard business suits, these were the standard business suits of the 4th century Roman aristocracy. And so we basically frozen the wardrobe of a dead empire and called it sacred. And this is a real danger, people, because I was in an order where it was kind of like almost, let's go back to the Siglo de Oro, let's go back to the 16th century when Spain was very Catholic, etc., and let's live like that. But we're in the 21st century. One cannot be anachronical and simply, that's Upadana, it's clinging to something in the past and trying to resurrect, it's trying to glue dead leaves back on a living tree. The living tree is Jesus Christ, and his church is not the institution, it's a living tree. And one cannot simply glue dead leaves back onto it. I'm aware that it's a living tradition, especially within Eastern Orthodoxy and elements of traditional Roman Catholicism too. But nevertheless, there is sometimes these things can only really be maintained by force, and therefore you end up with very high control institutions, high control spiritual father, a high control priest, a high control bishop, a high control monastery, for example, to impose this very anachronical set religious institution on a landscape which is moving in a completely different direction and of a completely different time. The Great Divide. Architecture changed to reflect hierarchy. The iconostasis or screen or altar rail was built, creating a physical inner circle. The clerics and the plebe, the laity, so-called. We're all laity because we're all the laus, tutheo, we're all the people of God. This whole idea, clerics and laity, it's for the birds. It's an invented scheme of medieval Christianity. Now, one could say that's a licit development, okay, but it means that it is a development and therefore not something that's take or leave, part of the essence of the blueprint of Jesus's church, per se. The shared meal became a heavenly court drama, and the people of God were demoted to passive, more or less passive spectators. So we've got a meal in a house of brothers. You're all brothers and sisters. Moving into basilicas with professionals in fancy costumes who occupy the upper throne, as it were, the altar. The iconostasis separates the people like a holy of holies. The people no longer have access to that. The grace is siphoned off through the hands of the priests, through the hands of the clerics. And again, is that a illicit development, or is that a confusion of the gospel? You have to decide for yourself. The diagnosis, the golden chain of Upadana. So when we resurrect these imperial trappings today, whether as an orthobro or a rad trad, we often trade the iron chain of Western moralism, what's perceived as, Western moralism, for a golden chain of ritualism. Often, people who embrace Eastern Orthodoxy from the West will say, you've swallowed the pill of Western legalism and ecumenism. They'll say, sometimes get those comments on my channel, but at the end of the day, all you're doing is swapping that kind of legalism, the legalism of the courtroom of John Calvin and Martin Luther and their understanding of imputed righteousness and atonement theory, which is, can be found in the Bible, absolutely. You're swapping that for the legalism and aesthetic legalism of liturgies and spiritual veganism for 200 days of the year. And, blind obedience to authority figures who are seen as the voice of God, the voice of Christ, circumventing and cutting out your personal conscience and your personal wrestling with the Word of God in the sanctuary of your own heart. Ascetic legalism, this is the Buddhists call this silabata paramasa, clinging to rites and rituals. We start believing that the form of the ritual is what saves us. And you get this massively among the modern liturgists. The atonement trap, we treat the liturgy as a payment plan to appease a demanding God. We think, well, if I perform these rubrics perfectly, I've paid my debt. The spiritual veganism and exclusivity of these institutions. They become fortresses. Fasting becomes a merit badge rather than medicine. We feel polluted if we visit a Baptist friend or Baptist church, God forbid, or Baptist communion. Whoa. How far have we come from the Lord's Supper of the first 300 years of the church? We feel polluted if we read a secular philosopher. This is the violence of the artificial, using guilt as a leash to keep the in-house tribe together. And of course, as I've explored in previous videos, this weaponization of hell, fear of hell at every juncture. Step outside the institution, the devil's coming flying at you. Now, if we're going to look at a cure for this, but one can find it within the tradition itself, hesychasm and the person of Jesus. Person versus institution. Let's look at that first. Buddhism and Christianity are not the same. In Buddhism, the person is a guide. So, Buddha is a guide. But they would say, whether Buddha existed or not, the Dharma, his teaching, is what's important. In Christianity, the person of Jesus is the point. We do cling to the person of Jesus because salvation, we believe, comes through him. He's died on the cross for our sins. He's risen from the dead to give us new life and invites us to live in that resurrection light and glory. So attachment to Jesus is life. Attachment to the institution, though, the imperial gowns and administrative exclusivity, could well be upadana, could well be a form of clinging to the raft, that's designed to take you to the shore. A form of, from an objective viewpoint, one might say a form of idolatry. Idolatry of specific sacraments, an idolatry of the church machinery and the church setup and the church aesthetic. The irony is that the cure is hidden inside your own tradition. So, hesychasm, interior silence, watchfulness, nepsis. This is the mindfulness of the East. It teaches you that you are not your religious ego, and that your thoughts are not you. The goal is holy dispassion, apatheia, a state where you no longer need the ritual to be perfect for you to be you no longer need the ritual to be perfect for you to be at peace. Now, one could say as a concession, there is a season where the raft is absolutely essential. Many of you listening might actually need that deep dive right now, the deep dive of Eastern Orthodoxy or the deep dive of traditional Roman Catholicism. Although I suspect that even having got this far, you're probably starting to be beyond the need for that deep dive, or at least questioning it, or at least interested in those who've taken that deep dive. You are fleeing a spiritual desert, and these traditions offer high-density nutrition. This is your season of being on the raft. But of course, when one gets to the other shore, one throws the raft or leaves the raft in the water. One doesn't carry it around. The Buddha taught that religion is a raft to cross a river. The raft is beautiful and safe, but the danger is that the raft becomes a jail or a golden cage, and that we essentially spend our time polishing this golden institutional cage, this fortress of defense and in-house self-serving. The raft is meant to move. If you spend years on it, you are more judgmental and anxious than you were when you started. You haven't reached the shore. You've just gotten lost at sea in a very expensive boat. So by way of summary, we've talked about a number of things here. The noble hunger. Your search for beauty is legitimate. The search for depth, the search for deep ecclesiastical history and something that is solid in a sea of change, in a sea of uncertainty. But everything is in flow, everything is in flux, including the institutional church, and any notion that the Eastern Orthodox Church has never changed is pie in the sky, wishful thinking, and mutatis mutandi, the traditional Roman Catholic Church. Beauty is the finger pointing at the moon, but it is not the moon itself. And remember, Jesus was not a Byzantine liturgist. He was a simple Nazarene carpenter with simple fishermen followers. And he left us a meal. He didn't leave us a performance. Simple. If he'd have left us a performance, we'd have had a New Testament Leviticus. We don't. The Imperial ghost, don't mistake the ghost of a Roman magistrate for the Spirit of Christ. The fancy stuff is imperial heraldry, not a divine requirement. Take it or leave it. Use it as a raft, but not as the other shore, not as salvation itself. That's why I would say it's not a salvation issue, whether you're a Roman Catholic or not, or whether you go to Mass or not, or whether you go to the Eastern Orthodox Church. I would say these things are indifferent. The Lord's Supper is the Lord's Supper. The final discernment, if your tradition makes you more judgmental, exclusive, and anxious about correctness. It has become a mirror of your ego, or could easily become one. If it makes you more humble and kind, it is a window to the divine. If it makes you obsess with shiny chalices, thurifiers, incense, smells and bells, and fancy performances, outfits and beards, and less about how do we serve the local homeless in our community? How do we provide for the poor in our midst? How do we preach the good news of Jesus Christ to those who don't have it? If there ain't none of that, there ain't nothing. And if your gospel looks like you must do a 3-year conversion catechesis every Tuesday, then one has to question that. Does that really reflect what we see in the Bible, or have we convoluted it? When I see, the likes of the eunuch, what is it, the eunuch and Philip, the apostle, in the Acts of the Apostles, the eunuch has come away from Jerusalem. He's been excluded probably for being a eunuch, bless him, African eunuch, and he's reading the Isaiah 53, and he's asking, who is this Messiah? Who is this suffering Messiah? Who is this suffering servant? And the Apostle Philip says, wow, I'm glad you asked. And one thing leads to another, and your man says to Philip, what's to stop me from getting baptized? Philip doesn't say, well, dude, you need to do a conversion course. It's going to take between 2 and 3 years. Hey, we could maybe speed it up to a year. No. Philip sees his sincerity. He says there's nothing to stop you. Of course, we're not getting into the argument, is he saved by his baptism? No, it's his faith in Jesus Christ. And seeing this faith, Philip says, that's all I need. Boom. Because, sometimes there's this idolatry of the sacraments, that the sacraments are so precious, we can't waste them. I did see some of this in the ancient traditions. Their water, their bread, their wine, they are powerful within the context of the community, but they're not to be idolized. People are way more important than the sacraments. The sacraments were made for Christians, not Christians for the sacraments. I don't think there's anyone who would argue with that. Let me know if there is, though. Go deep into the tradition then. Love the raft, but keep your eyes on the shore of love. Attach yourself not just to an institution. I've made a video before. You've converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, but have you converted to Christ? Because I see an awful lot of interest in smells and bells, institutions, in, my beard and my outfit and all the rest of it, the history of my institution, but I don't see a corresponding hunger to know Jesus Christ, to know the gospel of salvation. When the time comes, have the courage to even step off the raft in the full freedom of a Christian saint and be part of the shared meal that Jesus intended within the ugly modern world. I went to a charismatic worship the other day, and it was in an upper room, and it was fabulous. There was 20 of us in a circle, missionaries, ordinary family people, people with their struggles, ordinary folk, ordinary local folk, and some from not so local like myself. And there was a wonderful, everybody had a voice. We were brothers and sisters around the table. And different people every week will do not the consecration, but will say the words of the Lord's Supper from the Bible, and maybe they'll be invited to have a reflection over that. There's music, there's hymns. People come with maybe a word or a scripture passage. There's lots of prayer. And I just couldn't help but think this is the worship in spirit and in truth that Jesus talked about. You won't be worshipping on this mountain, on Samaria, neither in Jerusalem, but you'll be worshipping in spirit and in truth. And that's what Jesus is after. That's what God the Father is after. Not so much, I am Reformed Baptist and I am a guardian of the word. And not so much, I'm Eastern Orthodox or Rad Trad or anything else. You won't worship in Rome or Byzantium per se. You worship in spirit and in truth. I mean, in the context of the local community. And what happened to that 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, where it talks about the Agape feast and what it would look like. It does look very charismatic. People coming together with different giftings, with people not just sat on a pew waiting for the padre to fix everything, to do everything. Not talking about iconostasis and beautiful Byzantine performances. This followed the rubrics of the pagan liturgies that predate Christianity in the Greco-Roman world. I'm not saying they're invalid. I'm just saying they're not the essence of Christianity. Right, I will leave it there. Obviously, if people want to go and research this, I've already mentioned how you can very easily using AI and asking about this evolution of the Lord's Supper into Byzantine liturgies and into the liturgies of the Roman Catholic Church, the Mass. And also, you can look at the architecture of the ancient house churches at Dura Europos and elsewhere. God bless you. Adios.